Welcome to 'Cause We're Nerds, the show that covers trends in comic books, movies, video games, board games, and much more. Caleb's on assignment this week in Monte Carlo, so I'm your host, Chris. Today we're taking a look at one of the most influential comic books of all time, Watchmen. What makes it so important? Why are we only now getting continuations of the story? And where do we draw the line between supporting a creator and supporting a property? Find out on this week's episode of 'Cause We're Nerds. We're doing things a bit different this week. You'll notice that I'm flying solo, partially because of scheduling reasons, but also because a solo show is something that I've kind of wanted to try out. If you ever listen to any of the other episodes with me on it, you'll notice that I sort of talk a lot, and I'm sort of leaning into that. And this week, I want to talk about one of the most influential comic books of all time and look at it, or use it to look at the comic book industry as a whole, on how comic book creators are treated, how corporations respond to what comic book creators want. And that book, of course, is Watchmen, created in 1986 by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. So who are Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons? Well, Dave's a little easier to talk about, so let's start there. Around the time that Watchmen had been published, Dave had been doing a couple of things for DC. He did like a Green Lantern story, a couple of Brave and the Bold issues, a couple of Flash issues. Actually, him and Alan Moore met doing a Green Lantern story. He is a writer, occasional artist for DC, and has been doing stuff for them, on and off since the 80s. Alan Moore is a bit different. The first thing I need to get out of the way is, if you've ever heard about Alan Moore thinking he's a magician and think that he's crazy or like he's a wizard, well, okay, that's all true. But hear me out. His idea of magic is actually pretty simple and really interesting. So the idea behind Alan Moore's magic is that magic is influencing the way other people perceive things. So if I tell you to imagine like a beach with the waves crashing on the shore gently, you're imagining that, and you're hearing those sounds, and you're smelling that salty air. You're feeling the sand in your toes everywhere because it's coarse and gritty and it gets everywhere. But I just changed your perception of reality. Whether or not like you buy into that is totally different, but that's just what Moore thinks magic is. And so by creating something and using his ideas to influence the perception of others, he thinks that he's a magician, because using that sort of magic can be done for good on a wide scale. You can change how people perceive all sorts of ideas by writing about them, by making movies, TV shows, whatever, and by talking to them, by describing them in unique and interesting ways. And that's what magic kind of is, at least to Moore. At the time of writing Watchmen, Moore had already been working with DC for a couple of years. Based on his success with V for Vendetta, Judge Dredd, Doctor Who, as well as reinvigorating a couple of sort of like failing or old characters like Captain Britain or Miracle Man / Marvel Man, whichever it is now, I can't remember. DC editor at the time, Len Wein, decided to hire Moore on to continue writing Len's own book, The Saga of the Swamp Thing. Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing is still legendary to this day, partially because it created John Constantine, who you might recognize from DC's Legends of Tomorrow or the movie starring Keanu Reeves, but also because it's a deep and terrifying and emotional story with a lot of horror elements that kind of weren't in at the time, but it's a very, very unique and touching book. He also had a couple of successes with bigger characters like Superman. He did a couple of very, very acclaimed stories for The Man Who Has Everything and Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Both, I think, one of them is one issue, the other is 2 issues, and they're both very touching and very, very unique and very interesting. Definitely worth checking out if you have the time. Now, that's where Dave and Moore were. They'd met doing one of the Green Lantern comics, as I mentioned before. DC, however, had just bought in Charlton Comics. So Charlton Comics was a small independent-ish publisher that had only a couple of books at the time, and they weren't selling very well, so they sold to DC. Moore had like the an itch basically, and he really wanted to reinvigorate some older characters like he had done before with Captain Britain, Miracle Man, and most recently the Swamp Thing. Most recently at the time, anyway. So he went to DC and said, "I have a murder mystery revolving around the Shield." And DC was like, "We just we just bought the Shield. We're not going to let you kill him. But I tell you what, you do you. Just do it all original, and we'll sell it." So Moore and Gibbons got together and started working on Watchmen. So what's Watchmen actually about? Well, if you haven't read it, without describing, any spoilers from the book or from the movie or from anything else related to Watchmen, it takes place in an alternate history. Somewhere around the 1950s, superheroes started to appear. Everything in our timeline was more or less the same up to that point. But superheroes showed up and they existed. And they had like their own, golden age and silver age, but they weren't super powered. These were really just vigilantes. Around the late 70s, superheroes were outlawed. Vigilantes were outlawed, I guess. The only two heroes from the previous time that were able to continue working were the comedian who worked for the government and Dr. Manhattan, the only person with actual superpowers. Well, a couple of years later, the comedian is murdered, and Rorschach, one of the former vigilantes, finds out about this and starts looking into it. And as he keeps looking into who killed the comedian, he brings in a couple of other people from his past and or connections to the past of vigilantes, and it just gets wider and wider and wider and more complicated and way more interesting. So that's what the plot of the book is. But I guess that's not really what the book is about. You see, the book is really like about a loss of innocence for the superhero genre. Because up until that point, superhero books were pretty, hopeful and happy and colorful and campy, and there weren't really anything of consequence. And the heroes sort of like had to forget the lessons of a couple of issues ago so that they could keep fighting the same people the same way. And the industry hadn't really grown with its readership at all. Now, how is it a loss of innocence? Well, when someone talks about Watchmen, the first thing they're going to tell you is that it's a deconstruction of superhero books. So that word's kind of loaded in the sense that a lot of people use it and may not use it correctly. When someone says something is a deconstruction, it means that it looks at a genre and or even just a trope, right? And takes all of the pieces that make that thing up, looks at them individually and sort of applies a rigorous logic, either taking them to their most ludicrous conclusion or their most realistic conclusion. So there are a lot of deconstructions that can be satires. You'll find this a lot in anime with things like Konosuba, which is not family safe, but is still kind of a fun watch. But you'll also see it with things like Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is a super mature show that takes a look at how actually having to fight aliens and giant robots as a teenager would, affect someone that's developing like that when they're young. And it's not about being edgy or gritty, and that's what a lot of like things these days sort of don't get about being a deconstruction. It doesn't matter how dark it is. The point is that you take a critical look at all of the things that make whatever you're imitating work. So Watchmen does this by taking a look at like who are the sort of people that would become vigilantes? What sort of consequences would those people really face? How much punishment could their physical bodies take? What would having godlike superpowers really do to a person? And how does that affect their romantic relationships, their personal relationships? Or how does a complex about saving the world drive you to do the things that you do, whether they're good or they're bad? So those are the sort of things that Watchmen looked at. But beyond being one of the first and the most harsh, like critical looks at the superhero genre in that way, it's also just gorgeously and meticulously drawn, very well written. There's all sorts of wonderful world building in the book, including just pages of actual prose of in-universe documents or an example of, superheroes exist, so why would I read superhero comics? Well, instead now it's pirates. The comic books are pirates, and so there's a pirate comic book that goes along and sort of mirrors the story, and it's a very, very interesting book on its own, but it has that much more weight to it if you're understanding what it's looking at in the context of its time. And that's kind of easier if you take a look at what comic book superhero movies have become, and then read Watchmen and sort of apply that same critical thinking to the book. It's also the only graphic novel on Time's 100 Best Novel list, which is arguable in the sense that they should have more graphic novels on that list, but that's a pretty freaking big achievement for a funny book. So, when it came out, why was it so important? It redefined what comic books could do, but more importantly, it redefined what comic book audiences wanted. After it was released and people could sort of like knew what they wanted from comic books, and also based on Moore's own success at DC started hiring more and more British authors like Grant Morrison, Jamie Delano, Peter Milligan, and Neil Gaiman, who you will probably hear me talk about at some point in the future. These British authors and creators were brought over to DC, an American comic book company, to revitalize a couple of older characters and eventually started the Vertigo imprint, which was sort of like a mature warning label on the comic book itself. And just so that people knew that this wasn't really for kids. And this let those authors experiment with way more complex and unique and personal and messy stories than had ever come in comics before. And so Watchmen is really like the genesis of all of that. I mean, it was all kind of happening around the same time, but the success of Watchmen really cemented uh, how how much creative talent there was in England at the time. The Watchmen was a massive success. It was almost too successful. I'll get into why I say that in a minute, but you sort of have to understand that like the contract at the time was fairly unique. Except, okay, rather it was a totally standard contract, except for a couple of things. So DC told Moore and Gibbons that they wouldn't be making any merchandise. Now, in law, there's this whole thing where verbal agreements are almost as binding as actual physical contracts. That is its own whole episode. And it just sort of comes down to precedent and what state you're in and whether you're at the federal level and all that good stuff. But it's more than just a gentleman's agreement. It's usually enforceable. However, DC lied, sort of lied. They tried to get around the merchandise thing. So they started selling promotional button sets that Moore and Gibbons weren't going to see any money from. Moore and Gibbons found out about it, and Moore was pretty mad. Understandably so, because they straight up told him, "Hey, we're not doing this, but we'll do this thing that is exactly like this. We just slapped a different name on it." Eventually, they were able to come to terms, and they signed, some sort of agreement to get them both royalties from it. Except at the exact same time, DC was putting together a Watchmen role playing game that they didn't tell Gibbons and Moore about. So I don't know, like, why they didn't think that Moore or Gibbons would find out about this stuff, but whatever. It was the '80s. There were all sorts of substances. It's fine. Moore and Gibbons found out. Moore was quite mad again, except they were able to actually use this to their advantage a little bit, and they got him to have like actual input on the role playing books. So the game, the Watchmen role playing game, you can actually still find it, but I think it has two modules are written by Alan Moore. So there was one bigger problem. Fool me once, shame on me, or shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me three times, and we're done, right? So this third thing takes a lot of backstory to talk about. It sort of um, comes down to how comic book deals were structured at the time. So I mentioned that the contract was mostly standard. It had one clause, just one clause that said that after a year, the rights of the Watchmen characters and universe would go back to Moore and Gibbons if the book hadn't been in print that year. The reason this was in there at all was because of this weird little tiny sticking point in comic book history called the Creator's Bill of Rights. Okay, all right. Actually, hold on. The bill itself isn't that big. It's it's more of like a piece of trivia in the comic book industry that nobody cares about. But at the time, it was sort of like a zenith of a bunch of conversations that had been happening, both behind the scenes and publicly. See, at the time and even today, comic book artists, including writers, colorists, inkers, pencilists, anything in between, they're brought on as the work made for hire system. Basically, what this means is that the company that is hiring these creators is considered the legal author of the work. Creators are still credited in the books and anything related to it, but the corporation, such in this case DC, owns the things that actually get created under the terms of this particular contract. This goes all the way back to the 1930s, where Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster sold the rights of Superman to National Comics and were then hired on to continue creating it and got into all sorts of legal disputes about whether or not the company really owned the rights, even if they were the ones continuously creating new Superman stories. The biggest benefit to this model is that the characters survive the author. That means that authors can move on to other characters or work on other characters for a little bit of time. And those stories sort of just get to continue with a new team of artists. That's really, really good if you're a fan of older comic books that have been around for a while. But when you're creating new works and new characters within those stories, that sucks. There's no way around that. So in the '70s and '80s, creators were kind of tired of being seen as disposable, which I totally get. You don't want to be seen as that when you're doing all sorts of hard work that a company is just absolutely profiting massively on, right? It just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel like how the system should work, right? So they began forming their own publishing companies to give themselves more profits and more rights to their characters whenever they created something new, or also giving them leveraging and negotiating with the bigger comic book companies, saying that, well, if you don't want me to work for you, I'll go work for these people over here that have a better deal for me. Eventually, in 1978, there was an attempt to unionize all of these comic book creators. So the Comics Creators Guild was established in 78, and it had all sorts of huge names attached to it. So Chris Claremont, famous for the X-Men, Steve Ditko, Len Wein, who we talked about, Marv Wolfman, Jim Starlin, and Paul Levitz, and a bunch of other names that I didn't even list, were all involved with this guild. Now, the creation of this guild didn't really end up doing anything. DC sort of changed some of their policies a little bit, mostly like their pay rates, but they had an idea of pay rates that seemed more fair, but even adjusted for inflation aren't actually met to this day. This should sort of show you that it's comic book industry is a bit weird. In hmm, a bit weird? No, a bit stuck. Many creators tried again in 1988 by creating something called the Comic Book Creators Bill of Rights. It didn't actually do anything. It was a document focused mostly on how the creators of the comic should be able to decide how the collections of books are distributed after the initial print run of the individual issues, and it's not something that anybody cared about at the time and even today. But it's a good look at the sort of general culture surrounding comic book creators at the time. The reason that I make the distinction here between single issues and trades or collections is that at the time, trades were only printed for a couple of years. The single issues were only printed one and done, right? But the trades were printed for a couple of years afterwards, and then they were gone. So at the time of signing the agreement, Moore and Gibbons were under the impression that after a couple of years they would have the rights to Watchmen back. Except Watchmen hasn't gone out of print, and honestly, considering how good it is, probably never will, which in its own way is one of the highest praises. Still, Moore didn't like that line of thinking, and so he said to DC, "Fair enough, you've managed to swindle me for the last time, and I will never be working with you again." Which is mostly true. So after this fallout with DC, Moore went on to work over at Image Comics and then later Wildstorm Comics. These were comic book companies that were focused on giving creators more rights, giving creators better pay, giving creators better profit sharing of the books that they made. Moore was so successful over at Wildstorm that he got his own imprint called America's Best Comics. That's the imprint that the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, another Moore property that had been turned into a movie, was made under. However, when the comic book market crashed in the mid to late 90s, Wildstorm got bought by DC. Moore almost left immediately. But after being convinced that DC would not have any direct contact with him or interfere with his work at all, or even none of the money that he got would be coming from a DC bank account, it would still be the Wildstorm account. Moore agreed to stay on and finish the stories that he was writing, and then he quietly left, uh, taking his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen with him, but he wasn't able to take any of the other America's Best Comics properties because of the contracts that were signed at the time. Now, the story doesn't end there. It's not like he just sort of left Wildstorm and started doing his own thing. You see, DC and Warner Brothers really wanted to make a Watchmen movie, which of course they did. It was super popular at the time. And Moore and Gibbons were actually fine with this idea because every time they signed the rights away, they got some money, and then after a couple of years of the movie not actually getting made, the rights went back to them, and they would have to re-option them, and they could get more money. This went on a couple of times because there were a bunch of failed attempts, including one with Terry Gilliam, one with David Hayter, whose screenplay eventually got readapted into the Zack Snyder film, which I'll talk about in a minute. But those screenplays were often ridiculous or bad or both. So Moore and Gibbons didn't actually think the movie would ever get made. Come 2009, though, it did get made. Zack Snyder made Watchmen in 2009, and it was successful is a strong word, but it made more than its production budget. Not necessarily more than its production budget and its marketing budget combined, because we never actually get to see the numbers for the marketing budget. But it pulled in about $185 million at the box office and cost about $183 million to make. So it wasn't as popular as people expected it to be when they were trying to get it made. Moore didn't want anything to do with this movie at all. At all. In fact, he asked DC to leave his name off of it. So it's not Alan Moore's Watchmen, it's just Watchmen. And give all of his royalties over to Dave Gibbons. Gibbons didn't really seem appreciative enough of this particular deal, and he and Alan Moore had a falling out about it because Moore has, if you haven't noticed, some very, very strict standards and morals that he sort of stands by that seem kind of arbitrary to us on the outside, but whatever, it's his life. And so after this particular agreement, he and Gibbons stopped talking, basically. But because the movie came out, DC had another avenue to produce merchandise. So instead of it being Watchmen comic merchandise, which they agreed that they would never create, it was Watchmen movie merchandise. This is a big deal. Watchmen branded stuff is everywhere. You get hoodies, you get lunch boxes, you get toboggans, you get whatever you could want. Funko Pops, name it, it's probably exists. Even button sets, because DC has a great sense of humor. There's even a prequel video game for the movie written by Len Wein, which is really interesting considering that Wein is the whole reason that Watchmen got created, because otherwise Moore wouldn't have been hired by DC and wouldn't have been in the position at the right time to make Watchmen. And it's this is just a neat little thing. Neat's a strong word. Let's go with unfortunate little piece of trivia. But just that prequel wasn't enough because it was a prequel to the movie, which is slightly different than the comic books. In fact, DC had sort of approached more in the 90s and early 2000s to create a sequel to Watchmen or a prequel, depending on whatever they really wanted at the time. And they offered him the rights to Watchmen back if he decided to come and work for them again. He never took the deal. After being slighted by DC back in the 80s, he just didn't want anything to do with the company. So instead, DC continued to try making more of these books, but Paul Levitz, who I mentioned before as part of the Comic Creators Guild, was DC's editor in chief from 2002 to 2009. That means you sort of have creative control over what books do and do not get made. And Levitz was adamant that there would not be another Watchmen series without Moore. Now, he wasn't around after 2009, after the release of the movie. And so in 2012, DC released Before Watchmen. I don't have a lot to say about Before Watchmen. In fact, part of it is that if you don't have anything good to say about something, don't say anything at all. Not to just bash Before Watchmen. It wasn't well received either critically or commercially. it sort of just like it focused on existing characters and stories that happened, before Watchmen. So it looked at the more modern vigilantes at the time, and their early adventures, or the adventures of the original like 50s and 60s heroes, and it wasn't great. It didn't sell very well. There were a lot of cool creators on it, but it didn't actually do well. DC wasn't done with Watchmen though. In 2019, Jeff Johns, who is not really much of a stranger to picking apart Alan Moore's work and sort of expanding upon it, he decided that, as his role in editor in chief, that they should bring the Watchmen characters into the DC universe. So they announced Doomsday Clock, a 12-issue series that does exactly that. It brings Dr. Manhattan into the same world as Superman, lets them, go at each other. I don't know if they actually fight. I think it's just a premise, but you know, it's fine. That wasn't really well received either, for a number of reasons, and the creators on that, I'm sure, did a great job. They did what they could, and it just it just sort of doesn't stop. Also, 2019, there was the TV series created by Damon Lindelof. You know, Caleb and Jacob already did a great episode talking about the first episode of the Watchmen series, and that was episode 93. Go check it out if you've seen the series. But it's a really interesting thing that you see all of these creators put onto a project that historically treated its original creators very poorly, and it just sort of seems to follow these people around. Like Zack Snyder, his career after Watchmen didn't really go anywhere. Partially of that was due to health issues with his daughter, unfortunately, but also he just didn't have that much success afterwards. Damon Lindelof has already left the HBO show after the first season. It just doesn't seem to bode well for other people that touch Watchmen. It's really interesting that Moore's original interactions with the property were not some sort of warning for these people. So despite all of this nonsense with DC, Moore's been doing pretty well for himself. He recently retired officially after publishing the final issue of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And he's written a couple of novels and done a couple of things here and there. And it's probably like a Miyazaki retirement, where he says he's going to retire and then he's going to get bored and then create something else. But now that you know the whole story, does it change your opinions on the recent forays into the Watchmen universe? How deeply do sympathetic concerns inform the media that you consume? And at the end of the day, who's really watching the Watchmen? I actually do know who is watching the Watchmen. That would be Taylor Poole. Okay, all right. So that segue only really works, and there's somebody else on the show, but just work with me. Taylor Poole did our wonderful intro and outro music. You can check him out over at taylorpoolmusic.com. That's TaylorPoole music.com. This episode was a lot of fun to make. It was structured more as a casual essay than it was a discussion podcast like we normally have here at Because We're Nerds. But it was interesting and challenging, and I hope you all enjoyed it. You can find me over at twitch.tv/C&C Power Hour, where I stream Magic the Gathering and video games throughout the week with my friends. That's twitch.tv/C, the letter N, C Power Hour. Thanks for listening to Because We're Nerds. Stay up to date with all the nerdy news and podcast drops by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also leave us comments and feedback at causewe'renerds@gmail.com. That's CUZWERENERDS at gmail.com. You can also check us out at causewe'renerds.com. That's CUZEWERENERDS.com for the latest episodes, as well as some intro information about our hosts. And as always, if you enjoyed this podcast, we'd love it if you left us a 5-star review over on iTunes. And as always, stay nerdy.